by Dr. Ramya Gopinath will provide an overview of regulatory pathways and designations utilized by FDA to facilitate and expedite drug development for serious or life-threatening conditions, and will include a discussion of drug development programs for tuberculosis. Dr. Ramya Gopinath is a medical officer in the Division of Anti-Infectives within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, at FDA. She has been at FDA since 2015 and has worked with many drug sponsors on antimicrobial drug applications at various stages of development, on guidance for industry, and on regulatory science research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gopinath.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be with you today, and my topic for this morning is bringing new tuberculosis drugs to market, a regulatory perspective. In my talk today, I'll provide just a glimpse of the current landscape of FDA-approved drugs for the treatment of pulmonary TB. I'll spend the bulk of the talk on, first, outlining the regulatory pathways and designations enshrined in law and developed by FDA to facilitate and expedite drug development for serious or life-threatening conditions in general. And secondly, I'll cover some clinical trial design considerations for pulmonary TB in particular. This slide provides a quick overview of FDA-approved drugs for tuberculosis treatment. As you can see, this began with streptomycin in 1946, and the latest approval was that of pretomanid in 2019. There was a gap of 27 years after the approval of rifampin and capreomycin in 1971 until rifapentine was approved in 1998. After that, a full 14 years went by before the bedaquiline approval, and then another 7 years before pretomanid was approved in 2019. So drug development for TB is clearly an area of great unmet need. This slide provides a little bit of context and an overview of drug development, starting from basic research and identification of the lead compound through preclinical testing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and the NDA or BLA filing process, followed by a decision regarding approval. On the bottom of this figure are the typical milestones and milestone meetings that occur in the drug development process at different stages of development. Once the drug has been submitted to FDA, the usual review clock is 10 months. However, this is shortened to 6 months for priority review. Following approval, there may be some other activities that are focused on safety surveillance, in particular phase 4 studies. When we look at regulatory pathways and designations, there are two general approval pathways. One is the traditional pathway, which is based on a clinical endpoint that measures how a patient feels, functions, or survives, or on a validated surrogate endpoint, for example, viral load measurements for drugs for HIV infection. The accelerated approval pathway is an expedited pathway which is based on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or on a clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity or mortality. Aside from these, FDA has developed other programs to facilitate and expedite development and review of new drugs to address unmet medical need in the treatment of serious and life-threatening conditions. These are Fast Track designation, Breakthrough Therapy designation, and Priority Review designation. I'll go into these in more detail on the next slide, but it's important to note that Fast Track, Breakthrough, and Priority Review designations are applicable to both traditional approvals and the accelerated approval pathway. The Qualified Infectious Disease Product Designation, or QIDP, and the Limited Population Pathway for Antibacterial and Antifungal Drugs, or LPAD, are additional programs that I will discuss in the following slides. This slide is rather busy with details of expedited programs that FDA has developed, so I'll walk you through it slowly. In general, expedited programs are based on the recognition that patients and healthcare providers are generally willing to accept greater risks and side effects from a drug for the treatment of life-threatening and debilitating diseases than they would for treatment of other diseases. Columns 2 through 5 address fast track, breakthrough therapy, and priority review designations, as well as the accelerated approval pathway. The first column details the nature of the program, qualifying criteria, and the timing of the request. So if we look initially at fast track designation, this is provided when the sponsor has non-clinical or clinical data, a mechanistic rationale, or pharmacologic data that may demonstrate potential to address unmet need, or when the drug has been granted QIDP designation. And the request should be made along with the IND submission or after. Now, breakthrough therapy designation can be provided when preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may show substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over current therapies. Now, this may mean that it may demonstrate this improvement, but the evidence is not sufficient to establish safety and effectiveness for the purposes of approval. This evidence is usually from phase 1 or 2 trials, and it's important to understand that the clinical evidence needed to support BTD or breakthrough therapy designation is preliminary. So what is a clinically significant endpoint? Well, this is an endpoint that measures an effect on irreversible morbidity or mortality, or on symptoms that represent serious consequences of disease. It may include effects on an established surrogate endpoint, such as the viral load in HIV, that could support traditional approval, or a surrogate endpoint that is considered reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, which is the standard for accelerated approval. Priority review designation is granted when a drug would provide a significant improvement in safety or effectiveness, or when there's a supplement for labeling changes based on pediatric studies, or when there is an application with QIDP designation or a priority review voucher. Now, this request can be made at the time of submission of the BLA or NDA or efficacy supplement. And then, of course, we already have talked a little bit about the accelerated approval pathway. So this is for drugs that provide meaningful advantage over available therapies and demonstrate an effect on a surrogate endpoint reasonably likely to provide clinical benefit, or on a clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity or mortality. And the request for this is submitted during development. Now, it's important to note that the accelerated approval pathway is used primarily when the disease course is long and an extended period of time is required to measure the intended clinical benefit of a drug. And an example is certainly the drugs that are used for TB treatment. This slide brings a continuation of the table we just saw. Again, across the top, you see in columns 2 through 5 are fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review. Column 1 here now details the timelines for FDA response and additional features and considerations of each of the programs. So when we look initially at fast track, this includes a rolling review, which means that different sections of the NDA package may be submitted at different times for review rather than as one complete package. Breakthrough therapy designation brings intensive guidance on further drug development, senior organizational commitment to progress of the development program, and a rolling review. It's important to note that both Fast Track and Breakthrough Therapy designations may be rescinded if the program no longer meets the qualifying criteria. As noted earlier, priority review brings a shorter time clock from 10 months to 6 months, and the designation is granted at the time of filing of the NDA or BLA. Now, accelerated approval, as noted previously, is based on a surrogate or intermediate clinical endpoint, but it's important to recognize that confirmatory trials are necessary and that FDA can mandate that a drug approved under this pathway be withdrawn from the market if the benefit is not confirmed. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we, in a later slide. Qualified Infectious Disease Product, or QIDP designation, is used for antibacterial or antifungal drugs intended to prevent or treat serious or life-threatening infections. It applies to a specific drug product from a specific sponsor for a specific use, and particularly drug substances, biologics, or devices do not qualify for this designation. The designation can be requested at the PIND or IND stage, and it provides the following incentives. It brings an additional 5 years of marketing exclusivity for certain drugs, a priority review for the first application for a QIDP product, and eligibility for a Fast Track designation. The Limited Population Pathway for Antibacterial and Antifungal Drugs, or LPAD, is used for drugs that are intended to treat a serious or life-threatening infection in a limited population of patients with unmet need. FDA may conclude that there is a positive risk-benefit balance in a limited population, even though insufficient data exists to conclude that there is a favorable benefit-risk profile in a broader population. The advantage of LPAD is that it provides for a streamlined clinical development program for a limited population that may involve smaller, shorter, or fewer clinical trials, but it's important to note that statutory standards for safety and effectiveness must still be met. Now, seeking approval under the LPAD pathway does not preclude seeking any of the other designations or the accelerated approval pathway. The request must be submitted with the original NDA, BLA, or efficacy supplement. It's important also to note that the LPAD pathway should not be used to manage known or potential serious risks associated with a drug that may be addressed by different mechanisms, or should not be used to salvage a trial that fails to demonstrate its objective, and must have very specific labeling statements so that healthcare providers understand the limited population for whom the drug is intended and the limitations to its use. Thus far, 2 drugs, Arikayce in 2018 and Pretomanid in 2019, have been approved under LPAD. So now let's move on to some specifics about TB drug development. The activity of antimicrobacterial drugs can be evaluated in trials of early bactericidal activity, or EBA, and or in phase 2 trials with microbiological outcomes at early time points. EBA trials evaluate the quantitative counts of viable tubercle bacilli from daily collections of sputum and can provide information on the bactericidal activity of single drugs or of a new regimen in clearing MTB from the sputum of patients with newly diagnosed pulmonary tuberculosis. These trials are not intended to provide definitive treatment for patients, but rather are meant to evaluate antimicrobacterial activity in a brief setting of 7 to 14 days. Patients that are appropriate for enrollment in EBA trials would be those that are immunocompetent, those that are treatment naive, usually adults at low risk of drug resistance or extrapulmonary disease, who can then begin standard of care treatment for pulmonary TB at the completion of the EBA trial. Now, phase 2 trials that are designed to assess antimicrobacterial activity of the investigational drugs when combined with other antimicrobacterial drugs as part of a treatment regimen can be useful for evaluating possible doses or regimens before initiating phase 3 trials. Long-term follow-up with collection of clinical endpoints in addition to earlier time points should be conducted. The contribution of each drug to the treatment effect should be adequately evaluated, and 2 adequate and well-controlled trials are optimal. However, at least 1 adequate and well-controlled trial that demonstrates clinically meaningful and statistically robust treatment effect in subjects with pulmonary TB may suffice. However, if this route is followed, there must also be confirmatory evidence from non-clinical and in vitro studies, EBA studies, and early phase trials, as well as an adequate safety database. Generally speaking, in such a program, there should be at least 300 participants or patients that have been exposed to the investigational drug at the same dose and duration that is intended for approval. In case of a more serious safety signal, additional safety studies may be required. So going on to clinical trial designs. So one type of trial is a non-inferiority trial in which an investigational regimen performs within a pre-specified margin of performance of the standard regimen. A data-driven justification of the NI margin must be provided based in part on historical evidence of sensitivity to drug effects, or HESD. Examples of trials with an NI design would be trials where the investigational drug replaces one of the drugs in a standard combination and the regimen performs within an acceptable NI margin based on the quantitative contribution of the new drug to the standard regimen, or for a treatment shortening trial in which an investigational drug or regimen administered for a time period of fewer than 6 months is compared to the standard regimen administered for 6 months. In this case, non-inferiority would be demonstrated by showing that the treatment shortening regimen containing the investigational drug or drugs performs within a pre-specified margin of the performance of the 6-month regimen. The margin is based on the known decrement in the performance of the 6-month standard regimen when it is administered for a shorter time period. In superiority trial designs, this is, for example, when an investigational regimen shows superior efficacy over the standard regimen. This kind of trial design usually applies when an investigational drug plus optimized background regimen, or OBR, is compared to placebo plus OBR. Alternatively, this design may also apply when a regimen of one or more investigational drugs is compared to a standard regimen with efficacy demonstrated by showing superiority of the investigational regimen over the standard regimen. So going on to study populations for TB trials, trials should include adult and adolescent subjects if at all possible. Pediatric subjects or populations should be included as early as possible. Subjects with drug-susceptible or drug-resistant MTB would be included, obviously depending on the population for which the drug is being developed. As mentioned earlier, the clinical design considerations that I'm discussing today are for pulmonary TB. Sponsors that are developing drugs for extrapulmonary TB should discuss their development program as early as possible with FDA so that there is clear agreement on the endpoints to be used. Of course, persons living with HIV should be included in trials as much as possible. And if the trial is intended to focus on drug-resistant TB, some enrichment strategies could include enrolling contacts of subjects with drug-resistant TB or subjects in areas with a high prevalence of drug resistance, or those who relapse after previous treatment, and those who, in whom disease progresses even though they have been on a standard regimen. Trial endpoints should be well-defined and reliable. A clinical endpoint, as we've discussed before, directly measures the therapeutic effect of a drug. So, in other words, how a patient feels, functions, or survives. The surrogate endpoint is a marker, such as a lab measurement, radiographic image, physical sign, or serology, that is not by itself a direct measure of clinical benefit, but is validated and known to predict clinical benefit, such as the viral load in HIV infection, or an endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. The surrogate endpoint that is traditionally used for tuberculosis trials is the sputum culture conversion from positive to negative during treatment. This is measured either as a time to conversion analysis or at a fixed time point from randomization, for example, at 2 months. The time to sputum culture conversion is the time to the first sterile culture, verified by MTB culture negativity in at least 2 subsequent consecutive sputum specimens taken at least 7 to 14 days apart. And these should be obtained at specific time points during treatment, for example, every 2 weeks or every month. Additional considerations for a drug approved under the accelerated approval pathway, would be that FDA requires the sponsor to then study the drug further to verify and describe its clinical benefit. The studies that are generally required are phase 4 confirmatory trials. And if the confirmatory trial actually verifies the clinical benefit on the basis of which the drug was approved under the accelerated approval pathway, then FDA grants traditional approval. However, if the confirmatory trial does not show that the drug provides clinical benefit or does not verify the initial benefit seen, FDA does have regulatory procedures that could lead to the removal of the drug from the market. The suggested primary clinical efficacy endpoint for tuberculosis trials encompasses survival plus evaluation of MTB growth on serial sputum cultures at fixed time points following randomization, and a period of follow-up after completion of the planned treatment period during which the participant should not relapse. Obviously, this clinical endpoint applies to pulmonary TB. Clinical success would therefore be defined as someone who is alive, who has achieved MTB culture negativity on serial sputum samples, and has not experienced any relapse during the follow-up period. Conversely, clinical failure indicates progression of pulmonary disease on treatment, the need for a switch in therapy due to intolerance or clinical progression of disease, signs or symptoms of TB that recur during the follow-up period, growth of MTB on sputum culture, so either the failure to achieve culture negativity or the failure to maintain culture negativity after a specific time point during treatment or during the follow-up period. And certainly death during treatment or follow-up would count as clinical failure. The safety of drugs developed for tuberculosis or any other condition for that matter is obviously paramount. Based on signals from non-clinical studies, appropriate safety safeguards need to be included in clinical trials. These may take the form of enhanced or specific safety monitoring and in the formulation of the inclusion and exclusion criteria and other measures. As you all know, hepatotoxicity and QT prolongation are quite common with already approved TB drugs. In any drug development program for tuberculosis, specific attention should be paid to these potential adverse events and appropriate monitoring should be instituted. As discussed previously, a safety database of 300 subjects may suffice in the development of drugs for subjects with unmet medical need. If additional safety data is required, this may be requested through the performance of post-market studies or enhanced pharmacovigilance. I've covered a lot of information in this presentation, and it may be useful to see how some of these pathways and design considerations were utilized in the relatively recent approvals of 2 TB drugs. Bedaquiline was approved under the accelerated approval pathway using a surrogate endpoint of time to sputum culture conversion, and it underwent priority review. The approved indication is for adults with pulmonary multidrug resistant TB. The 2 phase 2 trials, which were the basis of approval, were randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials in which newly diagnosed patients with pulmonary MDR-TB received bedaquiline or placebo in combination with OBR. A total of 101 participants received bedaquiline in these 2 trials. Now, as you've learned, because it was approved under accelerated approval, a confirmatory trial was required as a post-marketing commitment, and the final study report for this trial is due in the next year. The follow-up period in this trial was for 2.5 years, so it has taken some time to complete. Pretomanid was approved in a combination with bedaquiline and linezolid, the so-called BPAL regimen. It was approved under LPAD for a limited population of adults with pulmonary extensively resistant or XDR-TB or treatment intolerant or non-responsive MDR-TB. Limitations of use are included in the labeling. This approval was based on a single-arm phase 3 trial with 109 participants. The endpoint was not sputum culture conversion, but bacteriologic failure, clinical relapse, or clinical failure at 6 months from the end of therapy. There was no comparator because there were no effective comparator regimens for XDR and MDR patients who did not tolerate the test regimen. The applicant used matched recent historical controls of XDR patients treated at one of their hospitals in combination with literature review. Because it was approved under LPAD, no confirmatory trials are needed. Again, there is a lot of information in this presentation, but I just want to emphasize that FDA is committed to working with industry, academia, and other partners to further the development of new drugs for tuberculosis and/or discuss innovative treatment regimens, including those that are shortened. Early engagement with FDA during the drug development program is strongly encouraged. And sponsors seeking indications for extrapulmonary tuberculosis should discuss endpoints that evaluate the extrapulmonary sites with us so that we can agree on these endpoints during the course of drug development. Thank you so much for your attention during this presentation.
Right, thank you, Dr. Gopinath, for that fantastic presentation. She will be back to join the Q&A panel with us a bit later this morning. And now we'll move on to our next presentations, which will describe the use of the tentative approval pathway for drug products to quickly get critical antiretroviral medicines found acceptable for use into the areas of greatest need. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we'll have Commander Tina New, who is currently assigned to the FDA as Regulatory Project Manager Team Leader for the Division of Project Management in the Office of Generic Drugs. As team leader, she directs a team of regulatory project managers to manage the review and approval of abbreviated new drug applications, or ANDAs. She also leads and manages all the uh, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR ANDAs. Next, we'll also have Dr. Peter Capella, who is Director of the Division of Immediate Modified Release Products 2 within the Office of Life Cycle Drug Products within the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Dr. Capella has nearly 15 years at the FDA supporting generic drug quality review across a wide range of therapeutic areas, and his group directly supported PEPFAR ANDA quality assessments both pre and post marketing. And next we'll have Captain Monica Zabelos, who is a subject matter expert and lead coordinator in CDER's Division of Antivirals. She manages and coordinates the regulatory review and approval of activities of HIV antiretroviral new drug applications for use in the PEPFAR program. Now, please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Commander Tina New.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. With a show of hand, how many of you have heard of PEPFAR program and handled PEPFAR applications? And how many of you remember interacting with me on your application status? Well, I hope to see a few hands out there. If not, for those who don't know me, I'm Commander Tina New, Regulatory Project Manager Team Leader at the Office of Generic Drugs. I'm presenting to you on the PEPFARs known as President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and you will hear the term PEPFAR throughout the presentation. I will begin this presentation by outlining PEPFAR program and its impact, then the roles of generic drugs in PEPFAR. I will provide an overview of the approval pathway, the PEPFAR eligibility and criteria. After that, I will introduce briefly on PEPFAR change amendments. We will end the presentation with a few take-home points. There are two other speakers, Captain Monica Zabelos from the Office of New Drugs and Dr. Peter Capella from the Office of Quality Pharmaceuticals, presenting on PEPFAR right after my talk. So let's walk together back to the basics of PEPFAR. Are you ready? All right, that brings us to the importance of the PEPFAR program and its overview. What is PEPFAR? PEPFAR is a United States government initiative in response to the global AIDS crisis in 2003 to help save the lives of those suffering from HIV/AIDS around the world. It was originally announced by the President George W. Bush's State of the Union address in 2003. After that, the United States Leadership Against Global HIV/AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria Act of 2003 was signed into law, creating the PEPFAR. PEPFAR is overseen by the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, who is appointed by the President. Up until now, PEPFAR funding is more than 110 billion in funding, including the funding for Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, to which the U.S. government is the largest donor. The last I looked at the PEPFAR database, there are 239 PEPFAR applications with 303 products listed in the PEPFAR database, after 19 years launching of the PEPFAR program. What a significant contribution. Did you know the epidemic control strategy spans more than 50 countries around the globe? However, the listing here is the 13 high priority countries that receive majority of the funds and represent the most vulnerable communities to HIV/AIDS. What are PEPFAR's program goals in the nutshell? The goal of the program was to provide preventative measures such as contraceptive counseling, provide care through HIV and tuberculosis screening services, and providing treatment by making antiretroviral products available to the assisted countries. Mainly, number one, transitioning from an emergency response to promotion of sustainable country programs. Number two, strengthening partner government capacity to lead the response to this epidemic and expand prevention, care, and treatment. Additionally, invest in innovation and operations to evaluate the impact, improving the service delivery of the program. Furthermore, the program's goal is to integrate and coordinate HIV/AIDS programs with broader global health and development programs to maximize impact on health system. And this will be accomplished in partnership with and through attainment of the joint United Nations program on HIV/AIDS, the 90-90-90 framework that was set in 2020, in which 90% of people living with HIV will know their status. 90% of people who know their status are assessing treatment, and 90% of people on treatment have suppressed viral loads and an expansion of HIV prevention. On June 8th, the United Nations adopted the 95-95-95 framework treatment target with the hope that by 2030, 95% of people living with HIV aware of their HIV status, get 95% of people who know their status to be on HIV treatment, and for 95% of people on HIV treatment to be virally suppressed. If the global community works together and reaches these targets, guess what? 3.6 million new HIV infections and 1.7 million AIDS-related deaths will be prevented by 2030. I have provided a little background of PEPFAR. Now I will talk about generic drugs and why generic drugs are so important. A generic drug is a medication created to be the same as an already marketed brand name drug in the dosage form, safety, strength, route of administration, quality, performance characteristics, and intended use. In other words, you can take a generic medication as an equal substitute for its brand name counterpart. Generic drugs provide a safe and effective alternative to brand name products at a much lower cost. Additionally, I just want to let you know that approximately 90% of prescriptions filled in the United States are with generic drugs. And on the average, the cost of generic drugs is about 85% lower than that of the brand name drugs. Role of generic drugs in PEPFAR. First, to review and tentatively approve, or TA, the antiretroviral abbreviated new drug applications known as ANDAs, for procurement under PEPFAR. Certain antiretroviral products that have been granted a TA may be distributed or used outside of the United States, even when there is still patent or exclusivity protection in the United States. The drugs can be purchased for use in the high prevalence, resource-constrained countries that partner with PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and/or similar programs. Therefore, receiving a TA is critical to PEPFAR's success. With TA, products can be used abroad under PEPFAR, expanding the number of HIV treatment availability. Second, it protects domestic patents of the reference listed drugs or the innovator product. Last but not least, to save money for the PEPFAR program while ensuring the medication purchased are safe and effective. PEPFAR TA is an expedited review that allows the FDA to rapidly evaluate ARV drugs from any manufacturer and to issue approval for use in PEPFAR programs if the ARVs met FDA standards of safety, efficacy, and manufacturing quality. Second, it permits products that are not approved for marketing in the U.S. to be purchased and distributed in resource-constrained settings. A key advantage of tentatively approval designation is it makes life-saving ARV available at a lesser cost. There are 3 regulatory pathways a manufacturer could take for approval of PEPFAR drugs. They are 505(b)(1), 505(b)(2), and 505(j). Captain Monica Zabelos will explain in great details regarding to the 505(b)(1) NDA pathway, and my main focus is on the 505(j) ANDA pathway. So, under this pathway, generic drug applicants do not repeat clinical or preclinical studies to establish safety or efficacy. The ANDAs can be approved if the applicants establish that the drug is therapeutically equivalent to the innovator products. Additionally, all ANDAs submitted to the PEPFAR program get a priority review. However, the applicants must request priority review, and FDA may decide to grant priority review if the criteria are met. And I will go over the criteria in the next slide. PEPFAR eligibility is first identified and validated at the time of submission by the Division of Filing Review at the Office of Generic Drugs. And then the applicant will have to meet the criteria set by the agency. They are the following. Number 1, the application submitted to the FDA must be for a drug product previously approved and listed in the Orange Book, or you have seen the term approved drug products with therapeutic equivalence evaluation. And after that, the applicant must provide a patent certification, either a P2 or P3 to all listed patents in the Orange Book for their RLD or the reference listed drug product. Thirdly, the drug product must have an indication of treating HIV or AIDS disease in your application. Fourth, the applicants must make a formal request to have the ANDA reviewed under the PEPFAR program. And this may be stated in the cover letter of the application, or you can put in a separate document. And I have here some of other consideration that I want to mention, that the request for review under the PEPFAR program should be made at the initial time of filing. However, an applicant may request for a PEPFAR review at a later date if all the previous criteria have been met. Again, anyone with an ARV product can request for participation under PEPFAR review. The original submission should state the applicant's intent to participate in PEPFAR. With regards to paragraph 3 or P3 certification, it is required to maintain the priority under PEPFAR program. PEPFAR regulatory project manager will ensure that P3 certification is made to all listed patents in the Orange Book. Once this is determined, we validate the priority of the review. So question for you. What happens when the applicant changes patent certification to P4? Then that means the priority for PEPFAR will be denied and no longer eligible for priority review under PEPFAR. One of the things that made PEPFAR ANDAs unique from other ANDAs is the fact that sponsors participating in PEPFAR will also provide additional long-term stability data to show that their product is able to maintain stability under climatic conditions of many of the PEPFAR countries, hot, humid, hot, dry condition. Therefore, applicants may provide abbreviated stability data at the time of submission and additional stability data submitted on a rolling basis. Dr. Peter Capella will provide more information in his presentation, so please stay tuned. Then, when the application is ready for tentative approval, the project manager will insert in the PEPFAR tentatively approved language in the letter indicating that, quote unquote, this ANDA was reviewed under the expedited review provision of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Then next we'll talk about the container language. Now, due to the emergency situation in PEPFAR country, child-resistant closures are not required for PEPFAR products to be tentatively approved. For full approval, we will need to switch to child-resistant packaging for all consumer unit of use containers. Last but not least, regards to labeling requirements, package label may be in a language other than English. However, for review package label other than English, applicants must submit English translation to the agency for review. Once TA'd, amendments to the ANDA are processed similar to supplements. This includes requests for full approval. Change amendments are managed by the OGD Division of Project Management Supplement Team. After the product is tentatively approved, FDA representative adds it to the list of tentatively approved and approved antiretrovirals eligible for procurement under the PEPFAR. I want to highlight some PEPFAR impacts here. Regard to cost saving, working in over 50 countries, PEPFAR has transformed the global HIV/AIDS response. PEPFAR supports over 27.5 million people with HIV treatment. Additionally, generic drugs play a vital role in making life-saving medication available in a cost-effective manner. By implementing the tentative approval process and decreasing the rate of HIV, we have indirectly lowered total U.S. healthcare costs. Education. By implementing such program, we not only learned how to provide these individuals with ARV agents, but it also taught us how to provide them with healthcare screenings and access to healthcare professionals. And because we already know the regulatory framework revolving around the tentative approval process, we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We can implement the benefits to another disease state. Working for the FDA, everyone has a voice in pushing the PEPFAR program's implementation into other disease states. FDA remains fully committed to these efforts. By working closely with other governments and public and private agencies and organizations, we can build on the impact and success of the life-saving PEPFAR program, expanding transparency, accountability, and partnerships so that the world can finally overcome one of the most devastating public health challenges in history. Lastly, I invite all of you to think creatively of different potential analogs public health situation and utilize this platform to save the lives of millions globally. If you don't remember anything I talked about today, this is a slide that you want to pay attention on, the practice pearls. I just want to give you a little bit summary of the main points. Number one, priority review. Remember, the applicant must request priority review upon submitting the application, and FDA may decide to grant priority review if the criteria are met. Second, your regulatory project manager is your best friend for status call and regulatory questions that you might have. So be sure to have the contact information ready and contact the regulatory project manager should you have any questions. My team handles PEPFAR applications, and I'm the team leader for the PEPFAR team, so feel free to reach out to me as well should you have questions or concerns about your application, and I'm more than happy to assist you. With regards to PEPFAR patent certification, remember a paragraph 3 certification is required to maintain the priority for review under PEPFAR program. From time to time, you might be contacted upon the resubmission of the complete response by the regulatory project manager if your patent is not clearly stated that a P3 still remains in your application. Remember, any changes to your patent certification from P3 to P4, the priority for PEPFAR will be denied. Last but not least, packaging. Packaging label other than English, you must submit English translation to the agency for review. Well, that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you for spending your time with me. It is my pleasure speaking with you today, and I hope the information is helpful. We'll see you at the Q&A session. Take care.
Thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about the drug product quality assessment considerations under the PEPFAR program at FDA. As way of overview, I'm going to go through the following points during this presentation. First, I'll discuss any differences in the standards between assessment of a U.S. drug product and one under the PEPFAR program. Also, I'd like to discuss some early challenges to performing quality assessments under the PEPFAR program, and then lead into how assessment practices really have changed or evolved during the early days of the PEPFAR program and now as we're entering into and continuing GDUFA. And GDUFA is the Generic Drug User Fee Acts, which began actually in 2012 and have been recurring every 5 years and are up for another new version in 2022. And finally, going back to a focus on PEPFAR, I'll look at the current areas that we're dealing with, primarily in the pre-tentative approval and post-tentative approval situations. All right, so a quick view on drug product considerations from a quality perspective. This is, again, for all FDA drugs in the U.S. market. We have at OPQ, which is the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, a patient-centric approach, which really boils down to thinking about the benefit to risk ratio for the patients. And from an FDA perspective, what we're really looking for is acceptable drug product quality. And we look through that, through our assessment, to try to improve that, but also we're looking for reproducibility of drug product quality. It's not just having great quality looking from a exhibit batch scenario, for instance. We're looking for quality throughout the product life cycle, certainly post-approval and post-TA, tentative approval. So part of that is, as you're familiar with, our submission requirements, right, for assessment of quality. And really, those boil down to and come into focus of product and knowledge understanding. Knowledge understanding is something we expect that the applicant has of the product they're making. But as FDA, that understanding is best demonstrated through providing us with the appropriate data. And those include things such as raw materials, information on processes, and certainly facilities, status of manufacturing facilities, as well as batch release data, stability study data for both drug substance and drug product, fully formulated drug product. And our expectation, of course, is that validated methods being used for all these aspects. So as far as considerations related to PEPFAR drugs versus the standard, I sort of tried to play a slight trick here. They're really the same, right? Because whether the product we approve or tentatively approve is used in a U.S. market or used anywhere in the world, our focus as FDA is on the patient and the benefit to risk for those patients. So really there's virtually no change or difference between our quality considerations for a U.S. marketed drug versus a PEPFAR marketed drug that could be made used for PEPFAR countries. There is one specific difference in drug product quality considerations for PEPFAR, and this graph gives you a clue to it, and that is temperature. Of course, in the USA, we're primarily looking at zones 1 or 2, although right now in the summer we tend to be much hotter than you would expect. But so for that case, we're looking at 25 degrees C and 60% RH for a typical stability storage condition in our applications. However, for the PEPFAR countries, we understand that, of course, they typically are on the hotter side and potentially higher humidity as well. So our expectation for long-term stability in those cases is 30 degrees C and 75% RH. And of course, we need assurance, right, that the quality will be maintained of the products when the medicines are stored under these conditions at the patient's place of usage. So again, we're looking for data to demonstrate that, and that's what would come in on these stability studies. So the challenges for the PEPFAR program and doing quality assessments of PEPFAR drugs in the early days are again, kind of hinted at in these two graphics here. First one is time constraints. Back in the early days, there was an extreme urgency to get these medicines available tentatively approved and sold, put out into the market because of the severe nature of the illness and the number of patients who were in dire straits without these medications. So time constraints, and then also, believe it or not, FDA had major resource constraints, especially on the ANDA side at the early days of PEPFAR. So we had limited scientific staff prior to GDUFA. GDUFA was instrumental in increasing our staff, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the second thing in terms of resource constraints was our style of assessment was primarily a single scientist approach. There are some benefits to this in that you have one person looking for the entire application, so looking at drug substance characteristics, development into the drug product, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are some benefits to that approach, but there are also some challenges in terms of timeliness, for instance. Okay, so how did we overcome these challenges, especially during the early days of the PEPFAR program in terms of drug product quality assessment of these drugs? And again, these graphics are kind of pointing you in the right direction. The first, with regard to time constraints, again, we had a lot of challenges early on, and the way we approached this was to allow for less data at filing, which is unusual. Typically for both generics and reference listed drug filings, we much prefer to have a complete package of information to make our assessment from the very beginning of submission. But again, due to the fast nature of these things, we were allowing, in the early days, less data at filing, but then with the understanding that solicited updates or amendments to the initial application would be coming. So it's sort of like this graphic of putting together a bridge in pieces. So the end result, of course, will be very sound and will be an acceptable quality package in terms of the application. So that's what we were striving for in terms of going with this approach of allowing data to come in sort of on a rolling basis, which is, again, not our preferred technique for certainly not for ANDAs. Now, as far as resource constraints, we had limited staff, so what could we do? And the answer was prioritization. So we wrote into our approaches to PEPFAR that we would give those ANDAs priority review within, certainly within the generic side as well as the NDA side. So recall we had a very large backlog of applications on the generic side in those days, so we had to balance the queue of all those filings with the fact that we had PEPFAR of such urgency, PEPFAR program. So prioritization was one means. And also, as I had mentioned before, the single scientist assessment approach, the challenge there was timing, as you can imagine. So for one person to get through an application from start to finish is a very significant lift in terms of time. So the idea was, why don't we split the assessment, for instance, have one person focus on drug substance side, another focus on drug product side, and just make sure that the two are coordinated so that they come up with a good picture of quality throughout the entire application. So that was our approach, was to go away from single scientist assessments to a sort of a split assessment situation. So that's how we overcame both of those challenges. So let me compare and contrast then the early PEPFAR days, especially for ANDAs again, which was also pre-GDUFA, to the current situation for both PEPFAR and GDUFA applications. So again, single assessor process versus our current team-based approach. And by team-based approach, I really mean a team. We have actually drug substance, drug product, manufacturing process, and facilities, and biopharmaceutics. All four of those disciplines are now have a single dedicated assessor as well as a project manager. So contrast that to the single assessor program where we had just one technical assessor and a project manager. So you can imagine the ability to get across the application assessment much more quickly under this current system. Also in the past, even though we had prioritization, there were no formal goal dates, and so it was made a little bit challenging to kind of keep track of everything, and it was kind of just work as fast as possible, but it was challenging without formal goal dates. So under GDUFA, all applications now have goal dates established, so it helps us keep track very carefully of where we are in that process. And even with the GDUFA goal dates that have been well established since 2012, we still prioritize PEPFAR filings because of the urgent need for them. Even having a larger portfolio than certainly at the beginning of PEPFAR, we still prioritize those applications to make sure that they get through as soon as possible. And thirdly, as far as the resource limitation, at the time of the early PEPFAR days and pre-GDUFA, we had quite a backlog of ANDA applications, for instance. And thanks to the GDUFA program, we've really basically eliminated that backlog and given us the ability to pick up all applications in a timely manner, whether they're PEPFAR and prioritized or just standard applications that are non-PEPFAR. Okay, so that was sort of a little bit of the history of where we were at the beginning of the program to sort of where we are now. With these next few slides, I'd like to focus on our current priorities under PEPFAR. And of course, our primary priority has been reaching tentative approval, and that gives us the ability to grant tentative approval, which would allow the products onto the market in PEPFAR programs. Now, as we move these to tentative approval, for now, we're focusing mostly on what we call combo products. And from an FDA perspective, the term combo means that they contain more than one pharmaceutical ingredient. And without going into the great details, for antiretrovirals, they tend to be much more, having a combination of antiretroviral drugs can help overcome resistance to any single drug, for instance. So we've applied this approach, but it does create challenges from a quality perspective, and that challenge really is increased complexity. And that includes possible interactions between the actives and additional excipients, as well as the complexity now of impurities and degradant issues. So we could have, now you've got impurities and degradants to follow for not just one active, but two or maybe even more. So it's much more challenging. And this is just a quick snapshot of some of these combinations. And each of them has different challenges based on the particular active that we're looking to towards approval. All right, so that was one of the priorities, which is getting things to tentative approval, right, so they can be distributed in the PEPFAR regions. But also there's the post-tentative approval aspects that we have to consider. And post-approval aspects, what I'm meaning is we're maintaining that tentative approval status, even that when minor changes are being made by the drug product manufacturer. And two of these changes I'll go through a little bit here. One is requesting to increase shelf life of the drug product, typically beyond 24 months. In most cases, by the time we get to tentative approval, there's enough data to support a shelf life of 24 months. But there's advantages to obviously going beyond 24 months from the patient perspective. And secondly, there's the increasing tablet count per bottle. And this would actually minimize visits to a doctor, pharmacist, or provider of the medicine. This is done typically also in the U.S., certainly. And so you could see bottles, rather than 30 tablets per bottle, they could be either 90 or 120 even. However, in both cases, we do need assurance that quality will be maintained for the patient under these sort of stretching conditions. So how do we do this? How do we maintain, or how do we verify that the product is okay under these two situations? Well, the first one is pretty obvious. First, extended shelf life, we need additional stability data to assess. As the applicant can provide that, as they have more and more data on older batches, we can then grant extended shelf life and expiry based on data that supports it. Now for tablet count, we actually are sort of doing that same stability, but we're actually doing what we call in-use stability studies. These are pretty kind of intuitive, where you're just repeating opening, closing of the bottle on a daily basis, removing and testing tablets. It's something that the patient would be doing anyway, and you're just confirming that as you get towards the end of these bottles, towards the end of shelf life, for instance, that under those conditions, we still are maintaining critical quality attributes for the drug product. Assay, acceptable impurity limits, both very important aspects to maintain to ensure that the benefit to risk ratio is maintained for the patient. All right, so that was, like I said, a very quick summary of PEPFAR quality considerations as we do our quality assessments. And I just want to leave you with a thought about evolution, and in this case it's actually evolution of our approach at FDA for doing quality assessments. And the PEPFAR is a good program to kind of give you an indication of what happens under such emergency situations. We have to improve and keep trying to improve our time to reaching quality decisions. However, we cannot compromise our standards for quality. So again, we need to come to a very important patient-centric decision on whether or not we can grant tentative approval to these products. So we have to do it very quickly but very efficiently. So that's our goal that we've maintained. And I hope I've showed you how we've kind of changed how we go ahead about these assessments to some extent to improve the time to reach those decisions. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I want to thank you for your attention, and I will be very happy to take any questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation. I am Captain Monica Zabalos, Senior Program Consultant in the Division of Antivirals in the Office of New Drugs. As you can see on the screen, my topic is 19 years of PEPFAR. Today, I'd like to give you an overview of the regulatory history and considerations of PEPFAR. Next, I'll be looking at PEPFAR from the FDA point of view. Then I will move on to change amendments after tentative approval. Next, I'll cover requirements for final approval after an initial tentative approval. And then I'll showcase our new PEPFAR database. And finally, I'll go over how to obtain pre-submission guidance for NDAs. The Department of State Office of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and Global Health Diplomacy, ISGAC for short, and PEPFAR policy states that procurement of drugs must be approved by a stringent regulatory authority, i.e. FDA. PEPFAR can procure drugs other than antiretrovirals, such as antibiotics and drugs that treat opportunistic infections. It is just that for antiretroviral drugs, only those approved or tentatively approved by FDA are eligible for procurement under PEPFAR, as described in the 2006 fixed-dose combination guidance for industry. In this part of my presentation, I'd like to talk about the review timelines for original applications. The Office of Generic Drugs will prioritize the review of ANDAs as outlined in MAP 5240.3 Revision 5, because PEPFAR is a factor to do so. The review timelines are set by GDUFA in its commitment letter. For NDAs, which are reviewed by my division, there are two review classifications set by PDUFA. The standard review with a 10-month clock, and a priority review with a 6-month clock. This leads directly to my next point. How does PEPFAR differ from the FDA point of view? Most applications are tentatively approved. Tentative approval means that drugs passed all scientific requirements for safety and efficacy and quality standards, but cannot be marketed in the United States due to patent and/or exclusivity restrictions. Tentative approval is not a new regulation. It's a common practice in the Office of Generic Drugs since 1984. All aspects of review and inspections, both manufacturing and bioequivalency, must be completed and found acceptable prior to tentative approval. However, sale and active distribution of tentatively approved products outside the United States is a unique aspect to PEPFAR. In addition to this, I like to say that all the application requirements covered in yesterday's presentations titled the New Drug Approval Process and ANDA Approval Process apply in this case as well. Let's now take a look at the two review pathways. For ANDAs, some of the general characteristics are that the Office of Generic Drugs is the lead. For NDAs, my division within the Office of New Drugs is the lead. For ANDAs, there are no fast-track designations. But for NDAs, pre-submissions via rolling review for fast-track designated products exist. For ANDAs, there's a strict criteria for approval or tentative approval. For NDAs, this is more flexible and it allows for use of additional clinical information. It has a different label. And last, for ANDAs, there have never been user fee waivers prior or after the DUFA. For NDAs, there have been user fee waivers since the beginning. I know that the presentations that I mentioned earlier has discussed the different types of classifications, but really quickly, at one end of the spectrum in the ANDA world, you have the 505J applications. A J application has a reference listed drug, and it relies on FDA's findings of safety and effectiveness for a previously approved drug. The J application has to be bioequivalent to the RLD, and in vivo bioequivalency studies are required. The labeling is the same as the RLD with certain deviations. And J applications are eligible for approval and tentative approval. Generally, the animal and clinical data, new animal and clinical data, are not needed. At the other end of the spectrum is the 505(1) NDA, also called a full comprehensive NDA. A B1 application owns and has the right of reference to all the investigations needed to support approval. It's eligible for approval only, which makes it eligible for U.S. legal market protection. Between the two extremes of a 505J application and a full NDA lies a third option, a 505B2 NDA. A B2 NDA does not own or have the right of reference for all the investigations needed to support approval or tentative approval. The B2 application contains a change from the listed drug, and it can either rely on FDA's previous findings of safety and effectiveness, or it can rely on scientific literature references for new formulations. It's eligible for approval and tentative approval, and fasted bioequivalency studies are required. To date, of note, all the NDAs that have been approved or tentatively approved under PEPFAR are 505(2)B applications. Let's now turn to change amendments after tentative approval. I'd like to emphasize the following points. The scientific principles for the evaluation of change amendments remain the same versus supplements to approve applications. Generally, labeling and manufacturer changes are the only ones submitted for review. To make a risk assessment and determine the type of change, FDA recommends to use the 2004 guidance for industry titled Changes to an Approved NDA or ANDA, as well as the Q&A document. The official cover letter should state the type of change, and it also should provide a summary of all the changes and a justification for choosing the type of change. To determine what information or data should be submitted to support the proposed change, FDA recommends the use of the 1995 Guidance for Industry, SUPAC-IR, and the use of 1998 Guidance for Industry, PAC-ATLS. An annual update is recommended and may include stability and distribution data, and a cumulative list of all the submitted changes with their current status, i.e. pending, permitted, denied. This table shows the types of PEPFAR change amendments and their corresponding review timelines for NDAs. On one hand, we have a major change amendment with a 4-month review timeline. This type of change requires the submission of the change and a decisional action by FDA before its implementation. If the change is found acceptable, FDA sends a PEPFAR permitted letter by the 4-month review timeline. On the other hand, moderate and minor changes have a 6-month review timeline. These changes require submission of the change, but the change can be implemented 30 days after FDA officially receives the submission. If the change is found acceptable, FDA sends a PEPFAR permitted letter by the 6-month review timeline. After review of a change amendment, FDA generally sends the applicant one of 2 types of decisional letters. A PEPFAR permitted letter if the change is found acceptable as stated before. A PEPFAR deny letter if the change is found unacceptable. Either way, the original application will remain tentatively approved. The chart on this slide shows the number of change amendments submitted from 2012 to date. As you can see, the number of submissions submitted to FDA for review, both for ANDAs and NDAs, has increased over the past 10 years, with the exception of 2020 and 2021, showing a slight decrease due to the COVID pandemic, most likely. Now let's talk about requirements for final approval after an initial TA. First, the applicant needs to submit an official request for approval when all the legal protections for the reference products have expired. The applicant needs to submit the final printed label, compliant with 21 CFR 206, which is the uniqueness of the drug product appearance. The package insert needs to be submitted in SPL format. And the packaging needs to be child-resistant compliant with the Poison Prevention Packaging Act. And the media container, carton, and unit of use packaging also needs to be compliant. For more specifics for ANDAs, see September 2020 guidance for industry titled ANDA submissions, amendments, and requests for final approval to tentatively approve ANDAs. Moving on to the exciting news, prior to 2020, a static table, as you can see on your left, was the only way FDA made public all the original applications, both ANDAs and NDAs, that were tentatively approved and therefore were eligible or are eligible for procurement under PEPFAR. And in January 2020, as you can see on the right, FDA's new database was launched and is now managed by the Division of Drug Information within the Office of Communications. All the information from the former table has been included in this new database. This interactive, searchable, mobile-friendly database provides real-time insight into key metrics, and for the first time, it provides access to FDA-reviewed product labeling and much more. Currently, it contains original drug applications, 239 of them that have been tentatively approved or approved. And in the next phase, it will also contain change amendments that have been permitted. The database enhances communication with internal and external stakeholders to increase overall transparency. It provides greater utility and access to stakeholders seeking drug product labeling, pediatric uses, storage conditions or shelf life, and other critical information on antiretrovirals eligible for procurement under PEPFAR. As a final point, I'd like to tell applicants that they can obtain pre-submission guidance for their original NDAs using the division's pre-IND consultation program. This program is useful to discuss specific product quality questions, such as listed drug, dissolution method, including profile and acceptance criterion, morphic form stabilization, and any other regulatory, administrative, or clinical issues that the applicant may be seeking feedback for. Applicants don't need to have a real IND. The program is applicable to pre-NDAs and pre-drug master file discussions. We can have a teleconference, or we can just simply provide written responses to the applicants. Thank you for listening to my presentation. And now I'd like to address any questions that you may have.
Thank you all for the informative presentations. We will actually have one more session before our Q&A panel in which all the speakers from this morning will return. In this next presentation, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell Chan will provide an overview of the Oncology Expanded Access Pathway and how Project Facilitate is making the process more accessible to oncologists around the nation. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell Chan is a clinical analyst and team lead in FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence's Project Facilitate and has been a part of Project Facilitate since its launch. As a clinical analyst with Project Facilitate, he performs clinical reviews of expanded access applications and manages the Project Facilitate call center. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Commander Mitchell Chan.
Hello and welcome to Project Facilitate, an overview of expanded access and the review process. My name is Lieutenant Commander Mitchell Chan, a clinical analyst with FDA Oncology Center of Excellence's Project Facilitate, OCE's comprehensive program for managing oncology expanded access requests. Throughout this presentation, we'll cover 4 different objectives. The first objective is defining expanded access and the key requirements for an expanded access request. We'll also summarize the key responsibilities of the oncology healthcare professional when considering expanded access. We'll also identify resources available to requesters considering submission of an oncology expanded access request. And then lastly, we'll describe how Project Facilitate is a resource to navigate the oncology expanded access pathway. One of the most common misconceptions we receive from industry is that only physicians can be sponsors of single-patient expanded access applications. However, industry or drug companies can be the sponsor of single-patient expanded access applications on behalf of a physician. However, this also means that the drug company will be responsible for the reporting requirements as well as sending FDA all the required documentation. Expanded access encompasses many different terms, including compassionate use, pre-approval access, treatment IND, SPI, EIND, single patient investigational new drug, and emergency IND. Many of these terms are synonymous, and we'll be going over them in future slides. First, let's define expanded access. Expanded access is the use of investigational medical product to treat a patient with a serious disease or condition who does not have comparable or satisfactory alternative therapies to treat the disease or condition. This is in contrast with investigational medical product in a clinical trial where the primary intent is research. Usually in clinical trials, there's systemic collection of data with the intent to analyze it to learn more about that product. Patients can access treatment through three primary domains, the first one being approved drugs. These are usually studied and characterized, labeled, and have broad commercial availability. Patients can also receive investigational therapy through clinical trials. This is where the goal is primarily for research and the most efficient path to market and broad availability. Lastly, expanded access is another way for patients to gain access to investigational therapies. The goal for expanded access is access to the treatment and not research. This represents a unique opportunity when other options have been exhausted. Expanded access consists of many different types of applications. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll be going over non-emergency and emergency single-patient applications. There are, however, intermediate and treatment applications which consist of more than one patient under one application, but we won't be going over this specifically today. Single-patient expanded access consists of emergency and non-emergency applications that meet the definition of expanded access. For emergency applications, there's generally no time to submit the required documentation, and you're usually treating in lieu of IRB or board member approval. For non-emergency applications, you generally have time to submit all of the required documentation, and you will be receiving IRB or board member approval prior to treating the patient. To meet the definition of expanded access, the CFR set forth eligibility criteria to qualify. The patient must have an immediately life-threatening disease or condition, is not eligible or cannot access a clinical trial, and has exhausted all other treatment options. Human subject protection is vital to ensure the safety of patients while undergoing investigational therapy and applies to all expanded access requests. This involves informed consent, IRB review, potential clinical holds by the FDA based on safety, and reporting requirements such as adverse event reports and annual reports. Because investigational therapies are not yet approved, there are unknown risks when taking unapproved therapies. Sponsors should weigh the benefit and risks to initiating an investigational therapy, since it may not be known whether the patient would benefit, experience no effect, or suffer from serious adverse events. When the FDA reviews expanded access applications, we take into consideration the potential harm to the patient. We look at whether the patient has exhausted prior lines of therapy and determine the scientific likelihood of efficacious response in that patient's disease. There are potential benefits to expanded access, including providing oncology patients with access to investigational therapy when they have a life-threatening or serious condition and are willing to accept a greater risk. This also provides patient autonomy over their own healthcare decision. This can also bridge the gap between the latter stages of product development and approval by making the drug widely available during that period. And lastly, the potential benefit of expanded access is that this may also provide useful data to support drug development. This diagram portrays the vital components of initiating expanded access. Let's start with the top right with the oncologist that initiates the request, oversees the patient's treatment, and provides annual updates to the FDA. Once the oncologist determines which investigational therapy they want to use, they will contact the pharmaceutical company who will then determine if the product will be provided under expanded access, and if so, they will issue a letter of authorization to the treating physician. Once the oncologist has received the letter of authorization from the drug company, they will then submit an application to their Institutional Review Board, or IRB, that will review the expanded access protocol and informed consent to ensure the patient is informed about the nature of the treatment. At the same time the IRB is reviewing the application, the oncologist can contact Project Facilitate for any support. Project Facilitate can also assist in completing expanded access requests, answering regulatory questions. We also review the application and determine if the treatment is safe to proceed. The physician or sponsor responsibilities includes agreeing to overseeing the patient's treatment, working with industry to get the letter of authorization, filing paperwork with the FDA and the IRB, and they're responsible for the patient's care and ultimately the reporting. To better assist healthcare providers submit an oncology expanded access application, Project Facilitate was formed in June 2019 in response to public feedback received about perceived barriers in accessing the expanded access pathway. Project Facilitate's mission is to promote equitable access to investigational products for patients with cancer by providing comprehensive support to oncology healthcare professionals in completing expanded access requests. Before Project Facilitate was launched, a public meeting was held to gather information on the barriers facing healthcare professionals when approaching the expanded access pathway. We wanted to address these barriers and identify additional barriers that could affect access. We've identified unknown barriers that we'd like to investigate. These include the number of patients requesting expanded access, reasons for industry denials, and patient outcomes such as benefits and adverse events. We've also identified known barriers from feedback from the public, including potential unequal access, perception of burdensome process, and simply not enough resources at a facility to approach expanded access. Going forward, Project Facilitate continually evaluates these known and unknown barriers and determines the best way to strategically tackle some of these issues. Since launch, Project Facilitate has taken action to combat unknown and known barriers. We started collecting metrics on applications, recording reasons why applications were denied, and overall long-term surveillance of expanded access applications. We've also increased our public outreach to improve public awareness of expanded access. We provide personalized presentations and walkthroughs of expanded access and the regulatory pathway. And lastly, we are actively taking steps to reduce regulatory burden through providing personalized assistance to healthcare professionals and their teams, assisting with regulatory questions, and being available through phone or email to provide immediate assistance. In addition to the strategies we just reviewed when addressing barriers, Project Facilitate identified a two-pronged approach when improving access and awareness of expanded access. The first approach is meeting patients, caregivers, and family members where they are by providing information through the Reagan-Udall Foundation's Expanded Access Navigator website. Next, our primary goal is to improve the access burden and barriers by making the process as simple and easy to use whether you're part of a large institution or a small clinic with no or limited regulatory staff. There are many benefits of Project Facilitate, including a consolidated and easy-to-access point of contact for oncology single patient and emergency requests. We have dedicated clinical staff that are able to provide regulatory support and provide immediate feedback on application material or any missing information we may need. Another strength of Project Facilitate is our ability to provide requesters options for IRBs, including paid and free options. We also can provide regulatory contact information for drug companies if available. In addition to regulatory support, we can also provide or fill out forms if needed. Additional benefits of Project Facilitate have now been identified, such as our efficiency in processing times being reduced from an average of 3 to 5 days to 1 to 2 hours. We also collect metrics to identify trends, possible needs, and valuable data to improve our services. Lastly, we are constantly trying to improve the program and have launched an automated annual report reminder email that will automatically email sponsors within 60 days of their anniversary date to submit their annual reports or follow-ups. This slide depicts the pathway and life cycle of an oncology expanded access application. On step 1, the oncologist will identify the product and determine if their patient is eligible for expanded access. Step number 2, they will seek the letter of authorization, or LOA, from the manufacturer and submit to the IRB. Step 3, the sponsor will submit the package to the FDA, and this usually includes the FDA Form 3926, the letter of authorization, and the CV of the treating physician. Once the FDA makes a decision, and if granted, on step 4, the sponsor will be responsible for the annual reports and follow-ups, including withdrawals. Whether the sponsor is a physician or drug company, the pathway has specific requirements for each step of the way. We'll now go into detail what some of these requirements are and what your role as industry plays both as the sponsor and the company supplying the product. We'll first go over the industry agreement, the FDA application, IRB support, routes of submission, including how to contact Project Facilitate, and then we'll go over the follow-up. The industry agreement step is vital in the process. As a drug company, you play a vital role in determining access to expanded access. If you agree to provide the drug product through expanded access, you will provide the letter of authorization and any prerequisite steps such as legal agreements between your company and the treating oncologist. We'll go over all 3 of these steps in the next slide. The first step for providers is to contact the drug company to determine if they will provide the drug through expanded access. The Reagan-Udall Foundation is an excellent resource that is publicly available that has a searchable company directory where you can see if there are current expanded access programs available ran by the drug companies, and also to determine if there is contact information available for the respective company. The agreement step is usually the step that takes some time. This includes legal agreements between the oncologist and the drug company. From our experience, we often see a letter of agreement provided to the oncologist that details any requirements. Lastly, the letter of authorization is the key to this entire process. After the agreements have been completed, the supplying drug company will provide a formal letter of authorization, or LOA, that allows the physician to cross-reference the company's commercial application at the FDA. This allows the FDA to legally use data and information from the commercial application to do the safety review of the expanded access application for the respective patient. Without the letter of authorization, the FDA will not be able to go forward with the expanded access process for that patient. If industry is the sponsor, a letter of authorization won't be required to be submitted to the FDA, since as the sponsor, you won't need to cross-reference your own product for your own application. A complete submission to the FDA consists of the FDA Form 3926, letter of authorization, and the CV of the treating physician. If the sponsor is the drug company, a CV of the treating physician is still required so we can validate if the provider is qualified to treat the patient. The Form 3926 is vital in ensuring the FDA has all the information possible when determining if the investigational therapy is adequately safe for use in the patient. The form asks for specific information about the patient's medical history, treatment plan, and should be signed and dated by the physician. If industry is the sponsor, the industry representative will be the one that signs this form. But remember that all the clinical information in the Form 3926 is still required. The LOA is a vital part of your application to the FDA, as we previously stated. And to reiterate, the LOA isn't required when the drug company themselves are the sponsors and are using their own product. The next important part is the CV and qualifications of the treating physician. As mentioned before, this is still required even when industry is the sponsor. This helps us determine if the procedure or treatment is being performed by a qualified provider. Often, requesters attach the CV to the application, but can also instead fill out Section 7 of the Form 3926 as shown at the bottom. An abbreviated CV is also acceptable. Follow-ups are vital in ensuring treatment is safe. When making changes to the treatment plan, or if the patient is no longer on the investigational therapy, follow-up submissions will update the FDA on the latest safety events and protocol amendments going forward. Follow-up submissions are also helpful in determining if a group of patients may suffer from the same events on the same drug, or if some are benefiting. We'll go over some of these follow-up reports on the next slide. If the expanded access application is authorized, the sponsor, whether this is the provider or industry, is required to submit follow-up submissions. Safety reports are necessary to ensure risk is adequately mitigated in patients continually going forward. Often, FDA reviews active and past clinical trials as well as other expanded access applications to determine if specific events could be due to the drug, or if the event is more likely due to the disease. This helps the FDA collect data on drug products to determine if a large group of patients suffer from the same event and if there's a need to change or stop treatment due to any safety signals we may find from surveillance. Annual reports are important as they summarize the treatment of the patient for each year. This includes any adverse events the patient has suffered from, and also any clinical outcomes the patient is benefiting from. Withdrawals are another vital part of the follow-up and reporting requirements. When the patient is no longer on treatment with the investigational product, the application needs to be withdrawn. This can be due to the patient expiring, completing treatment, or the patient progressed and either never received treatment or had to stop. As an important note, please submit your follow-ups digitally or by paper, as Project Facilitate does not accept emailed follow-ups except for emailed safety reports. The two types of applications are emergency and non-emergency single patient requests. To help differentiate between the two, this flowchart will detail the differences. For emergency, there's often no time to complete and fill out all the application material, and you're planning on treating the patient within 24 to 48 hours. So the Form 3926, LOA, and CV aren't required upon requesting. Due to the urgent nature of the emergency requests, we often give verbal authorization over the phone in lieu of a formal letter. However, since the required documentation is not required immediately, they are required to be submitted to the FDA within 15 days of the application being authorized. The IRB review is also required within 5 business days of treating the patient. For non-emergencies, you have the time to get the required documents prepared and sent to the FDA and are usually treating your patient within the next week or two. Another difference is that IRB concurrence, whether a full review or an expedited review from a board member, is required prior to treating the patient. The regulations state that your application is safe to proceed after 30 days from the FDA receiving your application. However, we often send a formal letter via email prior to that 30 days. As mentioned previously in this presentation, we often review and authorize applications within 1 day. When industry or drug company is the formal sponsor of the application, we still require the CV or qualifications of the treating physician as we previously stated. Normally, when the sponsor is the provider is responsible for overseeing and submitting FDA reports. This includes safety reports, annual reports, protocol amendments, and withdrawals. For safety reporting, this involves detailing an adverse event that occurred while the patient was taking the investigational therapy. This includes both suspected and non-suspected due to the investigational therapy. Annual reports are due within 60 days of the yearly anniversary of the application. For example, if the expanded access application was authorized on June 1st, 2022, each year an annual report is due within 60 days of June 1st of each year. Protocol amendments are important as they keep the FDA informed of any clinical deviations and changes to the treatment plan. This can include changes in treatment doses, schedules, and concomitant medications. When providing support to physicians, Project Facilitate often uses the Reagan-Udall Foundation Expanded Access Navigator. The Reagan-Udall Foundation has created an easy-to-use public tool that provides factual information and serves as an overall roadmap for expanded access requests. Both healthcare providers and patients will find these tools easy to use and helpful in determining how to approach expanded access and if expanded access is an appropriate pathway for them. The Reagan-Udall Foundation's Expanded Access Navigator serves three key user groups: healthcare providers, patients and caregivers, and companies or manufacturers of drugs, biologics, and other interventions. This supplements Project Facilitate services with focused portals to help each stakeholder understand the process, their role in the process, and FDA reporting requirements and support. This is especially useful for patients and caregivers since Project Facilitate is specifically for providers, physicians, the regulatory offices, and industry. The RUF's website also contains a company directory. If you know the company's name, you can put that in. While the FDA cannot help you identify a product to use, if you know the patient won't qualify for a trial, you can also enter in the disease state here, which may also show you products that are available or are currently under expanded access programs for specific companies. The Reagan-Udall Foundation makes the process even easier for oncologists and their teams through the new Expanded Access e-request. Head over to the Expanded Access Navigator and click the e-request link at the top. E-request can be used for oncology applications, but it can also be used for non-oncology applications. This route ensures that all applications, oncology or not, can be submitted in a user-friendly online dashboard. Be assured that your application will be received by Project Facilitate if you submit an oncology expanded access through this route. Overall, you have two pathways in submitting an oncology expanded access application. You can email your package to Project Facilitate, or you can submit it online using e-request on the Reagan-Udall Foundation's website. E-request walks users step by step through submitting their request to the FDA. It will ask you a series of questions regarding your application, provide you resources, and is easy to use even without regulatory or expanded access experience. E-request is a great alternative to emailing your application into Project Facilitate. Both e-request or emailing Project Facilitate directly will ensure your application is received in a timely manner. To recap the expanded access resources available, patients and non-oncology healthcare professionals can get resources at the Reagan-Udall Foundation's website. The FDA's Division of Drug Information is also a great resource where it has a website you can access as well as a phone number and email address that you can contact with any questions. For oncology healthcare professionals, their regulatory teams, and for industry, you can contact Project Facilitate at our phone number or email address, as well as find some useful resources on our website. And again, the Reagan-Udall Foundation's website for the EA Navigator is a great resource. When performing our clinical review of single-patient expanded access applications, we look at the safety, effectiveness, and alternate options available. Since investigational therapies have often not been proven effective in various populations and diseases, our primary goal is to ensure the product is safe enough for the patient to use for their specific disease. Sometimes, efficacy can be extrapolated from interim data and clinical studies. This means that we extrapolate clinical study data to determine the possible effectiveness and safety in patients outside of a clinical study. We also consider if alternate options are available, such as standard of care therapy and clinical trials. Since expanded access should not interfere with clinical trials, we want to ensure that the patient is first ineligible for a trial prior to initiating expanded access. We'll go over these a little more in the following slides. Safety is paramount in the review process. As stated previously, we often do not know if a specific investigational therapy will be effective for a certain condition. Our review determines whether the treatment plan is adequate in mitigating risk. We often look for a detailed monitoring and dose modification plan. These will state what kind of labs, assessments, scans, and other evaluations that will be performed and their frequencies. Dose modification plans should be detailed and include any dose reductions and holds that may occur and the criteria for such. When reviewing your information, we take into consideration the age of the patient and the disease or condition they are suffering from. We review clinical study data to determine if use in the specific age group and indication has been studied before, and if there's any information regarding dose-limiting toxicities, or DLTs, and known common adverse events. We also determine risk when looking at class-wide adverse events for a respective class of drug. For example, patients taking FGFR inhibitors could suffer from low phosphate while on the drug. As mentioned previously, it is sometimes difficult to determine possible efficacy for investigational therapies when there is limited efficacy information from clinical studies. Sometimes these studies could have interim data that could point towards possible efficacy for specific conditions, mutations, or diseases. When reviewing clinical trial data to support the use of single-patient expanded access, we review whether the patient's specific disease, biomarkers, and mutations have been studied before. Additionally, intermediate endpoints in a clinical trial can play an integral role in determining possible effectiveness of an investigational therapy in expanded access if the data is available. Lastly, we also review prior expanded access applications to analyze trends and possible areas of interest where an investigational therapy could be effective. Even though investigational therapy often has not been proven effective for a specific condition, we want to ensure it is safe for the patient to take. Chemistry and manufacturing is also an important part of the review process when this information is not readily available in the cross-referenced commercial application. The chemistry review is performed by an FDA CMC reviewer that determines the adequacy of the product. Some of the most common items requested include the certificate of analysis, which ensures identity, purity, and potency. Lot and batch information is also important when ensuring the product being used is within allowable specifications and expiration dates. Other data the FDA chemist may ask for includes data about the drug substance and drug product. Overall, a successful application generally consists of a few critical pieces of information. The LOA is the key to the submission and allows the FDA to use data from the cross-referenced application to review the expanded access application. Successful applications will also contain a rationale that explains the reasoning expanded access is being sought for the patient, as well as rationale about the treatment plan chosen. For example, is there data from clinical trials supporting the use in your specific patient? The rationale should also consider whether the patient's indication, age, and duration of treatment has been studied before, and whether the possible benefit of an investigational therapy outweighs the higher risk. Lastly, one of the most vital parts of a successful application is to stay responsive to FDA information requests. We often contact sponsors, whether they are industry or a provider, for additional information if needed. This can be anything from clinical questions or questions from our FDA CMC reviewers. Here you can find useful resources to get you started with expanded access. A great start is to go to the Project Facilitate webpage. Here you will find a lot of different types of resources as well as a video that is around 2 to 3 minutes long that explains the expanded access pathway. Project Facilitate is open from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and can be reached by phone or by email. If you are requesting an emergency request after hours, you may contact the FDA's Emergency Call Center at 866-300-4374. Thank you for attending this presentation on FDA OCE's expanded access and an overview of the review process. Many questions can be answered by visiting our website. However, we're here as a resource for healthcare professionals, regulatory, and industry requesters. So feel free to give us a call or email us and we'll be happy to assist you.
All right, thank you, Lieutenant Commander Chen, for that wonderful presentation. And now we will begin our first question and answer panel. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If you haven't had a chance to enter your question into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows. So our first questions will go to Dr. Gopinath. One question that came in for you. Should there be a plan of study for TB drugs in the pediatric population? And if so, when should that be formulated?
Thank you for the question. So certainly, as outlined in the presentation, the pediatric population is very important to include in study. Generally speaking, we need sufficient safety, evidence of safety, efficacy, antimicrobacterial activity, and PK in adults before the pediatric program. Generally speaking, the pediatric study plan should be submitted no later than 60 days after the date of the end of phase 2 meeting, or it can be at other time as long as that is discussed ahead of time with FDA. And often extrapolation of adult efficacy data to pediatric populations is acceptable for most pediatric populations, with the exception of very young children. And again, these plans should be discussed with FDA, especially for kids who are less than 5 years, just because of the differences in clinical manifestations and their pathophysiology.
All right, thank you for that response. We'll continue with another question for you. What were the reasons for not using seroconversion for the beta-quiline pretomated linazolid trial?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the presentation, the BPAL regimen, or pretomanid specifically, was approved in combination with 2 other drugs. And the reason for not using seroconversion there was that it was a single-arm trial. And so the primary efficacy endpoint was a bacteriologic failure plus clinical response plus the occurrence of relapse. So that's why seroconversion was not used there. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for that explanation. We'll still continue with another question that came in for you. Does the information about expedited pathways apply to ex-US markets where TB, AIDS, etc. are more problematic?
Thanks for the question. So the expedited programs that I outlined are based in regulation and policy that is specific to the US FDA. However, it's important to note that the trials that support the applications for which sponsors seek these designations and approval pathways are often, especially for TB drugs, are often and indeed usually conducted outside the US in countries or regions where TB is more common. In general, but not always, to be considered by FDA, drugs should be, the development program should be submitted and developed under IND prior to the NDA submission. So as outlined in those previous slides, depending on the designation or the pathway that the sponsor seeks, there are various stages during the development process where these should be requested or applied for. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Looks like you had a very popular topic. We have a few more questions. We'll do one more question for you. I am not clear on how FDA reaches agreement with the sponsors on clinical endpoints for extrapulmonary TB. Would you please explain with some examples, if any?
Thanks for the question. So to start with the second question first, I don't have any examples, primarily because extrapulmonary TB is a difficult area to study as a primary focus, and the recent approvals of TB drugs have been for pulmonary tuberculosis. However, if a sponsor specifically wishes to seek an indication for extrapulmonary TB, for example, lymphadenitis or osteomyelitis, the endpoints they wish to use must be justified and agreed upon a priori with FDA. So this may need several rounds of discussion, but it's an important question, so I just wanted to add that clarification. Also, I'm sorry that our time doesn't allow me to answer all the questions we receive, but I would like to refer you all to two FDA guidances that were referenced on my slide set and that you can actually also Google. So one is the FDA guidance on expedited programs, which provides a lot of information and even additional to what I provided. And the second one is the FDA guidance on developing drugs for pulmonary TB. This was first issued in 2013, and an update is currently in progress. So that will probably help answer some of the other questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gopinath. Okay, we'll now move on to some questions for Commander Tina New. First question for you. If you could, please provide guidance on reporting changes to tentatively approved products under PEPFAR.
Thank you for the question, Nora. Fourth proposed change amendment, and you can refer this to Captain Monica Zabello's slides from 7 to 11. I remember that. But however, from the NDA's perspective, the agency recommends that the applicants refer to the guidances for industry, and I can name a few here for you. Number one is changes to unapproved ANDA or NDA, the April 2004 version. The second one you can look up to is the changes to unapproved NDA or ANDA, questions and answers, and this is January 2001 version. And another one I can think of is the immediate release solid oral dosage form, and it's a scale up and post-approval changes for CMC. and that is the November 1995 version. And the applicants should submit the change amendments to the agency. And I just want to remind you that after the review of the submission, the agency sends the applicant one of the two types of action letters. Number one is a PEPFAR permitted letters if the change is found acceptable. And number two is PEPFAR denied letter if the change is found unacceptable. And the original application remains tentatively approved in either case. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all that information, Commander New. Our next question will actually go to Dr. Capella. Dr. Capella, what about in-use stability data? Are we required for accelerated condition or only long-term temperature? What is the duration of the study? Is it required?
Okay, thanks for those questions. Yeah, to follow up on the in-use stability situation, it typically is, as it says, for in-use conditions, and therefore accelerated conditions are not really applicable. The purpose of accelerated studies is for sort of a compressed stressing of the product to kind of understand its degradations or degradant production if possible. Whereas in-use study is really looking at the patient interface with the product. As far as like duration, it's typically based on the type of situation. So for instance, I think I mentioned a bottle with 90 tablets, say that's one, if it's a single dose per day, that's about 3 months and of time. So we'd expect the study of the in-use stability to cover that same type of time period. So as far as requirements, again, it really is based on knowledge and understanding. The reason that we look towards in-use stability for these larger bottle sizes is that, you know, again, 30 days is a typical window of usage that's very common. But once you expand beyond that, it does put a stress on the drug product stability because you are exposing it to perhaps humidity above and beyond when it's in a closed container, etc. So it really comes down to knowledge and understanding. So our expectation is that tablet sizes of packaging larger than 30, say it's again a 3-month regimen, you know, we would like to see data that supports the claim that the product, you know, maintains its quality. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those responses. One more question for you, Dr. Capella. Is there a peer review step as part of the PEPFAR approval process?
Yes, a very good question. Peer review is throughout. I know when I showed the expansion from a single reviewer to a team-based review, aligned team-based in OPQ, it seemed like we went from one person to say 5, but in reality, we went to one person with a peer review to now 5 people with effectively peer reviews for each discipline. And we also, I don't think I mentioned, have what we call an application technical leader. And this is a sort of a secondary level chemist who would evaluate our internal assessments for all the disciplines and make sure that we're harmonious and that we are presenting a unified position on quality to the applicant. So there are definitely several layers of peer review during the active process, as well as putting in the responses to the applicant. So, thank you.
All right, thank you for that information as well. Now we'll move on to a question that came in for Captain Monica Zabelos. Captain Zabelos, can we file shelf life extension beyond 24 months via an annual update for product TA under PEPFAR, or what is the correct path?
Thank you for the question. The short answer is no. As outlined in my presentation, slides 7 through 11, I talked about how to submit changes, change amendments after a tentative approval. For the specific question, we will like applicants to submit shelf life extensions via minor amendment. However, the review timeline will be different for an NDA versus an ANDA. For an NDA, the review timeline will be a 6-month clock, and the applicant will get either a permitted letter if the change was found acceptable, or a deny letter if the change was found not acceptable. Just to remind you, tentatively approved applications in general, because they're tentatively approved, we don't require the submission of annual reports. Instead, and as I stated in my presentation, we recommend companies to submit an annual update instead. But for the particular question, we do want them to submit it as a minor change amendment, both for NDAs and ANDAs. Thank you. Back to you, Nora.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll do one more question for you, Captain Zabelos. Let's see. How do I access the FDA PEPFAR database?
Yes, thank you for the question. The database is public, so if you go to fda.gov and you search PEPFAR, it will take you right to the landing page for the database. And from there, there is a button that you can click database, and that will take you right to the picture that I show you on my slide. Note, if you scroll down, there is a question and answer button, and it is important to click on that because that will really take you to different questions, different topics about what the data is all about, what products are we including in the database, and basically any other questions that companies may have about the database. Thank you for the question. Back to you, Nora.
Thanks so much. Now we'll move on to some questions for Lieutenant Commander Mitchell Chen. Lieutenant Commander Chen, can you explain when expanded access is used versus an open label extension study conducted by a sponsor?
Yes, that's actually a very good question. So basically, yes. So an open label safety study is primarily for characterizing the safety of the drug late in development versus expanded access, which is primarily for the providing access to treatment. So there is no intent for collecting data for commercial use in that sense, and so that's the biggest difference. And but however, in practice, many studies that are described as open label safety studies have characteristics that appear to be more consistent with treatment INDs or protocols, which was kind of covered in my presentation. I mentioned that we weren't going to go over that during that whole presentation, but it was mentioned where multiple patients can be under one application. So, so if an IND or protocol describes an open label study that provides for broad expanded access to an investigational drug in the later stages of development, but they lack planned systemic data collection and a design that's adequate to meaningful evaluation and safety issue. The FDA will generally consider the submission to be a treatment IND or protocol. So therefore, that would be considered an expanded access because at that point, it's more the purpose is to provide treatment versus gathering data at that point. But in that event, that the protocol or the application is not submitted as an expanded access protocol, the FDA's own review divisions will correct that to the correct expanded access application type.
All right, thank you so much for all that information. We have one more question for you, Lieutenant Commander Chen. For how long the industry should provide the drug to the patient on a SPIND or single patient IND after terminating the clinical study by the industry or drug maker when there is no plan to continue the development of the drug?
That's a very good question. And it is actually one of the most common questions that we get from industry. And the answer to that is that it is up to the manufacturer, the drug company, to determine how long you'll supply the drug product for single patients through expanded access, whether this is for single patient or for example, like we mentioned before with like treatment INDs where it's a little bit bigger. The FDA cannot force a manufacturer to provide product through expanded access, so there's nothing that says that we can tell you to do it for so many months, so many years. And this has happened in the past where sometimes treatment through expanded access has had to cease. But it is up to the manufacturer, and doesn't really involve FDA say in how long that should be.
All right, thank you so much for that information as well. We actually have one more question that we have for Commander New. And then this might be our last question before we take our break. So Commander New, what PEPFAR products can companies submit for FDA review?
Thank you for that question. In addition to the tentatively approved and approved antiretroviral products that are eligible for procurement under PEPFAR, there is a separate list of ARV drugs and the ARV fixed combinations that are most needed to meet the needs of HIV treatment. And the company should refer to this list when considering submission of applications for the ARV drugs intended for PEPFAR use. And again, this can be found in the database. Thank you.
All right, thank you again for that response. Looks like that is all the questions we have time for. Thank you again to all our presenters for the excellent information. We'll now